Welcome to America's Talking. I'm your host, Cole McNeely. America's Talking is a production of America's Talking Network. You can go find all of our great podcasts at americastalking.com. Today, we will be talking about the unprecedented, historical, at times insane, last 2 weeks of the news cycle that has included an attempted assassination against former President Trump, included the RNC convention, included pressure for current President Joe Biden to drop out of the presidential race, President Joe Biden ending up dropping out of the presidential race, the resignation of the head of the Secret Service, and more than that, believe it or not. And joining me to discuss this is the Center Square's executive editor, Dan McCaleb. Dan, welcome back to America's Talking.
Glad to be back. Thanks for having me, Cole.
We also have the Center Square's Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief, Casey Harper. Casey, welcome back to America's Talking.
Thanks, Cole. Good to be here.
And Brett Rowland, Center Square's investigative reporter. Welcome back, Brett.
Thanks so much for having me.
Dan, as I mentioned, it has been a intense couple weeks in the news cycle here. We actually kicked around several different America's Talking episode concepts, and within about 3 days, it got thrown out the window. In the past 2 weeks, we've had an attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump. You had the RNC convention, speculation as to whether or not President Biden would drop out of the presidential race, the fallout from the assassination attempt, the fallout from Biden then dropping out of the presidential race. And we're just kind of on edge here to see what's going to come next. Dan, I want to start talking about the most recent news coming out was the resignation of the Secret Service head. Let's start with that, and let's just talk about the fallout of what has been one of the more intense 2-week news cycles I think I've ever seen.
Well, you do have that right, Cole. Today, we're recording this on Tuesday, July 23rd. Kimberly Cheatle, the head of the U.S. Secret Service, after more than a week of pressure, mostly from Republicans, but there's been plenty of Democrats, too, who called for a resignation, resigned today, caving to the pressure because of the security failures at the event of, 9 days ago, where a would-be assassin got within 130 yards of former President Trump at a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. But for some incredible coincidences, act of God, however, whatever perspective you want to bring from it, didn't kill him because Trump turned his head at the final moment, grazed his ear with a bullet. Since that time, the Secret Service's security plan and execution of that plan has been under intense scrutiny. There was just a House hearing yesterday on it where Cheatle testified. Democrats and Republicans both called for her to resign, and that finally came this morning. And of course, this just comes 2 days after President Biden, I don't know if he shocked the nation or didn't shock the nation because there was all kinds of speculation that it was coming, resigned through a statement on social media. Didn't resign, pulled out of the 2024 presidential election, endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris, who now appears to be far and away the front runner and actually might already be there, the new Democratic nominee, if not officially.
Well, and you just mentioned Vice President. That is one of the things that I forgot to mention in my roundup of the last 2 weeks of news. Ohio Senator J.D. Vance chosen as Trump's vice presidential running mate here in the 2024 campaign. Casey, Dan just touched on Cheatle resigning today, the head of the Secret Service. There's been a lot of scrutiny in D.C. around this, bipartisan scrutiny as well. Nancy Mace, representative, had some very choice words with Cheatle yesterday. I hate to even leave it so vague as a question, but what is the environment in Washington, D.C. around all of this?
Yeah, I mean, the nation's capital is recovering from was really a seismic earthquake that was so strong it shifted really the terrain that this election is going to be fought on. You know, it's a totally different world as people walked outside and the landscape looks different. We have a different VP. We have even Trump is seemingly acting different based on, people were immediately saying that at the convention. And of course, with Biden gone now and Harris stepping out. And so I think you've had a total shifting even of political lines. You have Democrats infighting much more. You have a lot of unity among Republicans around Trump, or that's mostly been the case, but the assassination attempt only solidified that. You have certain key lines of attack that had become almost, shop worn, that have totally been turned on their heads. For instance, Trump being an enemy of democracy. I don't think Democrats are going to give up on that line, but Trump is able now and already has said, I took a bullet for democracy. It's a lot harder to call someone, a threat to the nation when they were the one who was almost killed. It really undermines that argument, I think, in the public's mind. Republicans have been attacking the Democrats for being so old, but now they have the younger candidate. So a lot of things have been turned on their head. And then with Cheatle and the Secret Service, we've seen, again, on this kind of new terrain, some rare bipartisan frustration with the Secret Service. And I covered that hearing, and it was really interesting because, at the beginning of the hearing, I think actually the lawmakers were pretty measured, both on the Republican and the Democratic side. And they asked several of the questions that we've all been wanting to know the answer to. Why was there not a Secret Service agent on the roof where the shooter was? Why did it take so long to respond? How is it that, as Cheatle confirmed, how is it that they identified that shooter as suspicious almost like an hour before Trump took the stage, and then Trump still took the stage? I mean, there's some really big questions. There's reports, that the shooter may have used a drone, but the Secret Service may not even have had drones. How is the drone allowed? And so there's a lot of questions like that. And when the lawmakers brought those questions, both Democrat and Republican, they quickly became very frustrated and very angry because Cheatle just almost answered none of them. She refused to answer almost any basic question, even questions that she had given answers to in media interviews. And so I think that is really where a lot of the frustration and the bipartisan, really by the end of the hearing, anger. You mentioned Mace, but we're talking everywhere from radical Republicans to, AOC out of New York City, all agreeing, calling for Cheatle to resign. And there was already those calls, but when she went up there 9 days after and couldn't answer and refused to answer even basic questions about what happened on that Saturday, the lawmakers, they had had enough.
And there's, I think, little question that after the assassination attempt, there was a influx of, I guess I'll call it political momentum for former President Donald Trump, right as he was going into the Republican National Convention to officially accept the nomination. All of that comes, Biden's already reeling at the time in terms of popularity, still dealing with the fallout of the disastrous debate performance he had against former President Donald Trump. This all ends in a week where, 8 days, attempted assassination of the former president, a spectacle of an RNC on the back end of that. And then the Democratic presidential candidate, or who was thought to be the presidential candidate, deciding to step out of the race. And Brett, what I thought was kind of interesting, you wrote a story after President Biden stepped out of the race, where former President Trump actually took issue with Biden stepping out of the race, saying this far into the campaign, this is unfair that they're kind of calling an audible here, 100 days from the election?
Yes. So, and there was one other piece of good news that I think that Trump got that sort of helped propel him to new heights. And that was that his classified documents case in Florida got dismissed by the judge. Casey covered that. And that was a big win for Trump heading into this crazy week. And I think that the power of that ruling can't really be overlooked, because that really sort of cleared up his legal calendar with the Supreme Court immunity ruling. And then this case tossed. He really hit new heights in terms of where he's headed and the things that are holding him back. So I think that was a really big deal.
Brett makes a good point. That would have been probably the top headline for days after the decision to throw out the classified documents case. It barely got noticed because of the assassination attempt, the start of the Republican National Convention, the increased calls on Biden to step out of the 2024 race, and then him actually doing that.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And the one thing, this episode is a little bit all over the place, but I think people can understand why, because the news, and it seems like the world has been a little all over the place the last couple of weeks. We haven't really gotten to the political implications to all these things. So again, I mentioned momentum probably going Trump's direction after the assassination attempt, that essentially seeming to convince Biden through polling and different things. It sounded like Nancy Pelosi stepped in and showed, hey, President Biden, there's no way you're going to win in November if you stay in the race for the Democratic Party, for the country as far as they see it, that you need to step out of the race. Casey, when we talk about Election Day coming up here in a couple months, what does the last 2 weeks mean? Obviously, you've got a different Democratic nominee than everybody anticipated. You have Kamala Harris being the presumed Democratic nominee. She struggled in the 2020 Democratic primaries. We've never seen her compete at the presidential level at a nationwide contest. You have J.D. Vance being chosen as Trump's vice president. I'm going to kind of leave the door open for you to say, what does this mean for the politics for the next couple of months here coming out of the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, I mean, right before I get to politics, I want to add on to Brett's point that the U.S. Supreme Court also granted, a presumptive presidential immunity for Trump, which was a huge win, could really threaten some of the other cases. It's probably going to delay a lot of things to beyond the election. So Trump really has been on a winning streak. But turning to Harris, in some sense, it's kind of early to say. She just kicked off her campaign this week. I think generally Harris is a weak candidate, but everything is different when you're running against Trump because Trump is so unique. He doesn't match up against candidates in the same way that a normal Republican would. I mean, to your point about the primary, people may forget, but Harris actually did not perform well at all in the Democratic primary. If my memory serves me right, she had about 6% support when she dropped out of the race with Pete Buttigieg to kind of they created this alliance essentially to get behind Biden so that Bernie Sanders could not win the nomination, who was actually going to win if they didn't do this. So Harris and Buttigieg, they dropped out. They got behind Biden to push him over Bernie Sanders. And then they were, of course, rewarded. Buttigieg is the transportation secretary and Harris the VP. And Harris is also, just policy-wise, she has to take on some of Biden's baggage. She has a pretty bad record from this term. A lot of that's his fault, not all of it, but, inflation's been out of control to about 20% increase since, Biden Harris took office. We have the illegal immigration crisis, which, Harris was the quote unquote border czar for a while at first. And that's the last thing you want to be in this administration because the border crisis has been historically bad. I mean, we have a couple of foreign wars that started under Biden's tenure. So Harris is going to have an interesting time wriggling out from under the Biden record in these last few years. And how successfully she can do that is going to be huge for her. She polls okay, but not great. I think she still has an uphill battle. What she has going for her is maybe some fresh momentum. There is a newness. She is younger than Trump, which that's been a major talking point this election, how old both the candidates are. So she does have the youth going for her. She was able to very quickly get a lot of the Democratic money and donors and delegates on her side. So she's not having to fight, at least for now, a messy last-minute Democratic primary against someone like Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer. So far she's able to kind of cement her power, it looks like. But she still has this tough record that Biden is having to overcome. And I'm not sure what Harris's identity is as a candidate. I think she has to determine that. She has to create her message. Because right now, if you ask people, what does Kamala Harris stand for? I don't think that that's really clear. How she answers that question and how she escapes Biden's record will really determine this race for her, I think.
The one thing that comes to mind for me on what does Harris stand for is abortion rights. She's been, adamant that the SCOTUS decision overturning Roe v. Wade significantly hurts women's health care rights. One thing I'm looking forward to, I hope we have it to look forward to, is remember the calls for Biden to step out of the race were amplified after his disastrous June 27th debate performance. With Harris presumably stepping in, Trump and Harris have not debated, of course not in 2020 during the first Trump-Biden matchup. There's nothing scheduled now. Of course, she's not the official nominee yet, so I would assume there would be calls for a debate either after the Democratic National Convention or, if there's a roll call vote ahead of the DNC and then Harris gets officially nominated. But a Trump-Harris debate or debates, hopefully debates, would be very interesting, I think.
Well, and beyond the potential for debates, we're still waiting to see, assuming, again, Kamala Harris becomes the Democratic nominee, there is a vice presidential candidate that would come alongside her. It'll be interesting to see who goes there, Dan. And Dan, do you really think that, well, let's be honest, Kamala Harris is relatively unpopular. I mean, it's not like she is riding a wave of, almost like Barack Obama did in 2008, where he was a very popular candidate. Kamala Harris is not a very popular candidate. I'm not convinced, looking at the situation, that she is the Democrats' choice. She is the Democrats' reality right now. And between President Biden and Vice President Harris, she seemed like the better option for the Democratic Party. But again, I don't think a lot of people would have wanted her to be the choice. And we go back to 2020, as Casey said, she's polling in the same neighborhood of where Vivek Ramaswamy was polling in the 2024 GOP primaries. I mean, it's not like she really sniffed the Democratic nomination relative to other candidates. So that being said, does that vice presidential choice that the campaign makes on the Democratic side, does that mean that much more because of that, Dan? I mean, is there a larger focus, I guess, and importance on who she chooses as vice president versus saying, Donald Trump, who has a very solidified base, people know him, known quantity? Does this vice presidential choice on the Democratic side mean more?
Well, I would say if we were to trust Vegas, and yes, believe it or not, Vegas has odds on who Harris, assuming she's the nominee, who she'll pick to be her running mate. Governor Shapiro out of Pennsylvania and Governor Cooper out of North Carolina are the two odds-on favorites, even though there are bigger names out there, right? People were mentioning Gavin Newsom out of California, Governor of California, Gretchen Whitmer, Governor of Michigan, even Governor Pritzker out of Illinois as potential presidential candidates if Biden were to have stepped out earlier. But right now, the odds-on favorite are two key swing states in this election, the governor of Pennsylvania and the governor of North Carolina. No, that's all speculation, of course, at this point. We have no idea if Kamala Harris is going to name a vice presidential running mate before she gets the official nomination, after. Obviously, it would come, at the Democratic National Convention or before. But yes, I do think who she picks as her vice presidential candidate probably has a little bit more significance than Trump choosing Senator J.D. Vance out of Ohio, just because it's so late in the game. And Democratic voters, those swing voters, those independent voters, maybe lean Republican, lean Democrat, I would think they're going to be paying attention to that selection.
And Brett, when the choice was made, and I say choice, but decision, I guess, by President Biden to step out of the race and endorse Vice President Harris, it's not as if there's a ginormous swing between these two candidates when they go up against the former President Trump, right? I think Harris, depending upon what you look at the polls, might be performing 1% to 2% better than Biden did, although at the same time, it's all within the margin of error. And you wrote a story at the Center Square talking about how once Biden stepped out of the race, that Democrats really said, hey, we've got to get down to work now in this short run. What are the Democrats kind of viewing the next 100 days as? I mean, is this just make the best of a bad situation? As far as you see it, what do you see on that Democratic side?
Well, I think part of it, we're going to have to wait and see. I think some of the polling that's come out so far has been early. As more and more data comes out, I think it'll be easier to read the race and we'll have a bit more idea of where things are headed. But I do think the Democrats have a big fight on their hands right now. I think that they're coming into a race where they've got a known candidate, Donald Trump, who is polling well, has, had these legal victories and survived an assassination attempt and is sort of, looking fairly difficult to beat at this point. And then they've got a semi-relative unknown in Kamala Harris, who's got a lot of work to do if she wants to take on Trump.
Casey, I guess I'll pose a similar question to you. What are you hearing in Washington, D.C. about presidential nominee Kamala Harris? Is this full go ahead? Is it hesitant support? Is it unification merely for the sake of unification on the Democratic side? I mean, what are you hearing?
It's unification out of sense of desperation. I mean, I think they feel hopeless. I think Kamala was skillful in gathering the support she did, and a lot of it had to do with the money. There was a lot of money had already been donated to the Biden-Harris campaign, and so I think that's been an underreported thing, that those tens of millions of dollars, where did they go if someone like Newsom tried to rise up? The Democrats don't want to split their money. And so I think that's one of the best things that Harris had going for her. I think they're going to try to rally. I mean, with no real opponent, there's nothing to do. I mean, if Newsom or Whitmer or someone wanted to pose a real threat, then it would be, grab your popcorn. We're going to have a race here. But so far, no one of enough gravitas in the Democratic Party is willing to fight Harris. So she's going to go full steam ahead. They're going to try to create a message. They're going to attack Trump. They're going to throw as much money into it as they can, try to have a successful convention. I wouldn't be surprised if there is some underground movement to try to make something happen at the convention. But right now, it's not looking successful. Could something change? Possibly. If Kamala has some kind of disastrous debate or something. But right now, the inevitable thing seems Harris v. Trump. And it just seems if Harris can change the narrative, I think she has a unique moment and a lot of attention on her to give it a shot right now.
I think a lot of it's going to depend on how much excitement she can generate. With Biden at 81, with all of his stumbles and fumbles and his debate performance and just almost every single public appearance he made, he looked old and he looked like he was in cognitive decline. And that's sort of, even those never Trumpers, it's hard to get excited about a candidate like that. So maybe you're not going to vote for Trump, but are you going to take your time to go to the polls to vote for a candidate you're not all that excited about? Kamala Harris is going to have to reignite and re-excite her base, I think, to get people to the polls. Can she do that? We'll see.
Well, and this is going to be an interesting, again, 3-month cycle to see here. The base of the Democratic Party, or maybe not the base, maybe I can call it the far left wing of the Democratic Party, have not been particularly happy with President Joe Biden over several things, but he's always kind of been viewed as a more moderate, politician, presidential candidate, everything. He's made his concessions, but the hardcore left wing has never been particularly happy with him. When we look at Harris, is Harris going to maybe appeal more to those Democratic base voters, maybe the Bernie voters? And is that why we have maybe that Josh Shapiro potential of a more moderate candidate, swing state candidate being the vice presidential nomination? Is this kind of the line they're going to try to tiptoe here going into Election Day?
Well, traditionally, Kamala Harris is and has been to the left of Joe Biden, who was considered more of a centrist Democrat. But during his administration, of course, with news over the last couple of weeks since the debate, who knows even, who's been running the government, if Biden's been making all the decisions that his administration's been making, or if he's been leaning on bureaucrats, other top elected Democrats or not. But during his administration, he's definitely gone left. When he was running for office, his decades in the U.S. Senate, he was definitely much more moderate than what his current administration, what he's done over the last 3.5 years now shows. But yes, Kamala Harris is more of a leftist candidate. One of the big things that's dividing the Democratic Party is the Israeli-Hamas war. The far left wing of the party, many, I should say, don't want to do a sweeping generalization, many in the far left of the Democratic Party had made anti-Israel statements and declarations, have been pro-Hamas, an outlet that the U.S. government designates as a terrorist organization. That's going to be a top issue. We expect at the Chicago Democratic National Convention next month, we expect thousands, perhaps tens and even more than that, thousands of protesters. And one of those major issues is U.S. support for Israel. That under the Biden administration, has wavered at times. But I do think Kamala Harris will get the support of the left. What choice do they have? It's going to come down to likely Harris and, of course, Trump. And there's some third-party candidates in there as well. But I think she'll definitely have the support of the far left.
And Dan, I hate to do this to you again. As a seasoned journalist, you've been doing this for a long, long time. Is it fair to say this election cycle between the convictions, the assassination attempts, the dropping out of the presidential race, the politics of it all, unprecedented, historical, one that we're going to look back on and say, man, do you believe all that happened within a 5-month, time span of sorts?
It's not even close. There's nothing in my lifetime that's even comparable to it. You call me a seasoned veteran. Many people have been saying that the upcoming Chicago Democratic National Convention next month is comparable to 1968. I was born in 1968, so I didn't live it. You call me a seasoned veteran, but I've seen nothing in my lifetime that you can even come close to comparing to what's been going on in this election cycle.
Well, Dan, Casey, Brett, thanks for joining us this week on America's Talking. I'm sure by the time we put this episode out, there will be something new hit the news cycle and completely flip all this on its head. But I want to thank you three for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Check out our other great podcasts at americastalking.com, and we'll be back next time with another episode of America's Talking.